I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after their king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I've never been quite able to determine, but certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis in terris. About the refinements, or as he called them, the quote-unquote ghosts of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in the jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over niceties wearied him. He would prefer rebelized gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire, and upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than any verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental quote-unquote powers still retained their quote-unquote fools, who were motley, with caps and bells, and who were expected to always be ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king was a matter of course, retained his quote-unquote fool. The fact is he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however, his value was troubled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarves were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But, as I have already observed, your jesters in 99 cases out of 100 are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-gratulation with our king that, in Hop Frog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hop Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of the 7 ministers, on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop Frog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement, and of course consolation to the king, for notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and the constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hop Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms, by way of compensation for a deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity, where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises he certainly moved more resembled a squirrel, or a small monkey, than a frog. I'm not able to say with precision from what country Hop Frog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person had ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hop Frog and a young girl very less dwarfish than himself, very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it was not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hop Frog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted. So she possessed much influence and never failed to use it whenever she could for the benefit of Hop Frog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents of both of Hop Frog and Trippetta were sure to be called into play. Hop Frog in especial was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costume for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the feat had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Trippetta's eye with every kind of device which could possibly give eclat to a masquerade. The whole court was in a fever of expectation. As for the costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume a week or even a month in advance, and in fact there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated I never could tell, unless they did it by way of a joke. More probably they found it difficult, on account of being so fat, to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and as a last resort they sent for Trippetta and Hop Frog. When the two little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council. But the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hop Frog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes and took pleasure in forcing Hop Frog to drink, and as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hop Frog," said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends." Here Hop Frog sighed. "And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters. Characters, man, something novel, out of the way. We're wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink, the wine will brighten your wits." Hop Frog endeavored, as usual, to get up the jest in a reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his quote-unquote absent friends forced the tears of his eyes. Many large bitter drops fell in the goblet as he took it, humbly, from the hand of the tyrant. "Ah, ha, ha, ha," roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "See what a glass of good wine can do. Why, your eyes are shining already. Poor fellow. His large eyes gleamed, but rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked around upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's quote-unquote joke. "And now to business," said the Prime Minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, Hot Frog, lend us your assistance." "Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters, all of us. Ha ha ha." And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was coerced by the seven. Hot Frog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly. "Come, come," said the king impatiently. "Have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf abstractedly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring!" cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you mean by that?" "Ah, I perceive you are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this." And he poured out another goblet full and offered to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. "Drink, I say!" shouted the monster, "or by the fiends—" The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up as best she could, and not even daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh and protected grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. What are you making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looked fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, "I? I? How could it have been me?" "The sound appeared to come from without," observed one of the courtiers. "I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon the cage wires." "True," replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion. "But on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth." Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a large set of powerful and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hot Frog entered at once and with spirit into the plans for the masquerade. "I cannot tell what was the association of idea," observed he, very tranquilly, and as if he never tasted wine in his life. "But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us in our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons, and—" "Here we are," cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of coincidence. "8 to a fraction. I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion? We call it, replied the cripple, the 8 chained orangutans. And really, it is an excellent sport if well enacted.